name's Damon. I'm currently based in Mexico City, but I have a long career in technology marketing all over the world. So I cut my teeth really with Microsoft as an intern back in 2005 and went full-time with them in 2006. And I spent several years with Microsoft, both in their corporate headquarters in Redmond, Washington, and then a few years in their UK headquarters in Reading, England, just outside of London. After that, I stuck around Europe a little bit. I completed my MBA at Cambridge. I worked for Google in Germany, and then I moved over to South Korea to work at Samsung for their corporate headquarters. I relocated back to the US in 2015. I started a small side business on my own at the time. It is a custom nutrition wellness brand. Sells mostly on online marketplaces like Amazon and Walmart. And I've been doing that for 7 years now. And then 5 years ago, I went off on my own and started doing freelance consulting work. I've had the privilege of working with really big companies like PayPal and all the way down to smaller companies like Series B, Series C startups.
Right. And I think that's how we got introduced to each other when you were working at
PayPal. Through PayPal, exactly.
Yeah. And they continue to be a great client for us. So that's great. That's a great introduction. I think one of the things I've known about you is that you have lived and worked in many places. So first question for you is about that lifestyle and the challenges and advantages that come from, where we're headed, which is the work from anywhere world. I know a lot of our consultants get into consulting because they want to gain that kind of flexibility. So I'd just like to hear from you, your thoughts about it.
Happy to share. And in fact, my thoughts are continuing to change, actually, and I'll get into that in just a moment. I started working remotely full-time 5 years ago when I moved from the US to Mexico. And I was really apprehensive about it at first. My entire career had always been in an office environment, and I didn't think that I could have an impactful experience working totally virtually. But luckily that faded very quickly. You can get a lot done with Zoom and being very available through email, Slack, and other channels, other means. Now, combining remote working with living abroad or not in your sort of home area is one lens in which I'll speak to. I feel it's very rewarding, frankly, if you can make the time zones work, and if you can commit to continuing to be available and make the remote working component work. Layering on top a new environment, new culture, new language, new experiences is really, really nice. It makes your day after you sort of sign off for the day that much more interesting and intriguing. I did it throughout, before the pandemic. My girlfriend, now wife, would be invited to a conference in Colombia, for example. And with a simple WeWork membership, you can set up shop in Colombia for a week, and instead of eating a sandwich or tacos for lunch, for example, you'll eat an arepa. It's really, really fun to sort of explore the world in that manner. But it's stable, right?
Yeah.
The other lens in which you could consider remote working or working from abroad is where you're sort of nomadic, right? This digital nomad lifestyle is one that's gaining a lot of traction recently. And I spent the last 3 weeks in Europe actually bouncing around. I was in 5 different countries in those 3 weeks. And I made it work, right? But it was difficult, I feel. It took away from both my enjoyment of being overseas and traveling, but also a little bit from my productivity, I feel, because it's really hard to stay consistent and have a predicted schedule when you're always on the move, when you're bouncing around a lot, when your environment is changing from a hotel room to a coffee shop to a WeWork to a train.
Sure.
So I know lots of people that make it work, but for me, when comparing the two, I think that the former is a lot more comfortable than the latter.
Yeah.
Relocating to a new country, sticking it out for the length of the visa, whether that's 30, 60, 90, or even 180 days, and developing a routine. And I think it's
I
really
think of it
important.
as rhythm, right? Because
Yeah,
every time you go to a new location, you have to get in a rhythm in
yeah,
terms of the space and what the sound is like and the and for me rhythm's important. That's what gets you into good uh, alpha waves into working. And if you're constantly disrupting the rhythm, it's just challenging. So
that's a great way of putting it.
yeah. And we have consultants who have migrated into the nomadic thing, but I think they tend to do it for longer periods of time. They'll do it for like a month or 2 months, and I think you can create that rhythm for yourself in that. But what you sound like what you did is a bit of a torture test for that.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's hard to get in the rhythm in either the pleasure side, like, oh, I love being a tourist and going sightseeing, or the working side, right?
Yeah,
Because you're sort of borrowing from both, and both suffer because of
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's great. So let's jump into crypto. When we had met a few months ago, you talked about you've been doing some crypto consulting. If you could give a quick explanation about what is crypto, and then go into the kinds of projects that you have done.
it. Yeah, happy to. Crypto is a bit of a dated and catch-all phrase. The vernacular is evolving just like the space is. Crypto is short for cryptography because the distributed ledger technology is based on cryptographic signatures and equations. So when you shorten it down, it comes down to crypto. But the more widely embraced and adopted term these days is Web3, right?
Mhm.
And when you look at the progression of internet technologies, you have Web 1, which is read only. They say, you go to a web page, you read what the page has to say, and you consume the content. It's a consume-based participation. Web 2 is really participatory, right? You get to contribute to the web. This is brought to light through blogging, through social media, posting pictures and excuse me, posting updates and content of your own. And they say that Web 3 is now the ownership phase of the web, where you can own pieces of the web, and through NFT technology or otherwise. So that's the trajectory that we're in right now. And so crypto or blockchain or Web3 or DLT, distributed ledger technology, are all being used interchangeably. I would say Web3 is probably the most grounded term. Now, what I've been working on, so I've taken a little hiatus this summer, but before, I was very fortunate to partner with a cryptoeconomic research firm. And they're very niche in the space. So crypto, Web3 or blockchain, operates like any other business where they have marketing needs, they have this development needs, the strategy needs. But one thing that is very, very unique about Web3 clients and technologies are designing what the industry is sort of called tokenomics. And I'll have to unpack that a little bit. So with most Web3 projects, there's a provably rare and artificially scarce resource, whether that's a token, or whether that's an NFT, or whether that's a coin or something like that, where there's a provably rare, artificially scarce resource. And when you have something like that, like digital gold or whatever, you have to create an economy around that to influence people's behavior. And that's really what separates Web3 projects apart from Web2 projects, is that ability to pull different levers to incentivize people's behavior. And what it comes down to is a mixture of excellent economics, because you need to know the rate of inflation, you need to know supply controls, distribution, and how money circulates, and how to control that circulation of money or tokens or whatever it may be. And we also need to know consumer behavior. You need to know game theory, because there's, again, like people will behave in certain ways based on certain constraints and certain rules of the game. And what also goes into that is sort of the governance of those rules and how those rules change over time, and how a closed ecosystem will be highly centralized at first and slowly become more decentralized over time. And that's the ultimate goal of Web3, is the decentralization of a lot of these projects and environments. So they're basically self-governed, self-regulated by the participants in these these ecosystems. But that's really it. I mean, the technology itself has been around for a long time. I think it was
Yep.
the 1950s or 60s. Read and write, write only ledgers were designed, and Merkle trees have been around for a long time as well. But it's only more recently that a lot of these concepts have been combined to create these Web3 projects.
And were any of your projects specifically marketing projects that you could kind of give us some flavor for?
That's a great question, and one that I'm actually looking to get into more these days. In fact, due to the nature of the work, this particular firm had divorced themselves from any marketing work, and the reason is, it's a very gray area. Some of these projects today, because what a lot of projects are trying to avoid is being classified as a security by the SEC, right? Offering something today for the promise of value later in the future. And when the firm creating the economic infrastructure of a project gets involved in the marketing of the same project, well, there's a conflict of interest there, right? Because the firm they know about the economics of the project, and they have a vested interest in gaining as many participants as possible. So in order to remove themselves from that conflict, the firm did zero marketing services. But that said, I was an observer of lots of marketing efforts and pushes, and marketing in the Web3 space is, I'd say, quite markedly different than the Web2 space. It has its, pros and cons. Unfortunately, it's heavily meme driven. Like, people will look. It's heavily participatory, right? So the life and death of many of these projects depends on who's engaged in the project, who's buying into the vision of the project, who's participating from a financial perspective. And in order to get that, Web3 projects have seemed to take in this groundswell of individuals sort of championing individual projects. And the way they do that is they take to Twitter, they'll use memes and this very interesting Web3 speak, where they'll shorten words and use sort of made up words that are like sort of part of the lure and vernacular of the space to drive interest and visibility around a particular project that they're individually vested in. So gaining visibility to a core set of like highly active, highly invested participants is a really key component of Web3 marketing. Web3, I haven't seen a single Web3 project that hasn't published a handful of very common, very expected pieces of literature for the community to digest. So that being like a white paper, a roadmap. Who are the founders? Are they pseudonymous or are they not? So there's a lot of those, and that has to gain traction. And then setting up like the channels in which you communicate in this space are also a little bit atypical. So Discord is the space where a lot of the marketing happens, and the marketing is really sort of like hand-to-hand combat, right? You set up this Discord, you invite a lot of participants into it, you need to regulate it and police it and ensure that it's not being taken over by bots and unsavory players. So it is a very rapidly evolving and very different non-traditional space to be marketing in.
So I mean, it's as a consultant, if you were going to dive into the area, to me, anytime you go into some place that's rapidly changing and growing and adapting, it's exciting because there's like this learning curve, this education curve that you're going on. And I know some people find that to be intimidating. I know that few times in my career when I've jumped into a new industry, something that's new to the world, that's just part of the job. It's like you have to spend part of your time educating yourself. Did you find that was the case? Are you like constantly reading new things, consuming new information, and
completely?
And how do you balance that with the actual consulting work?
That's a really great point you make. Really good question and observation. I'll address it in two ways. One is that is it comfortable to be in a space that's so rapidly changing? Well, I would reframe that perhaps. I see a lot of similarities in this transition from Web 2 to Web 3 today that I saw a decade ago,
Yeah.
the transition between software and services, and
Yeah.
cloud services. And at the time, I was very fortunate to be one of the first employees on the Office 365 team at Microsoft. But at the time, I see so many parallels, like people breaking a lot of glass as they experiment with the technology and how to market it. Adoption challenges and reluctance to adopt the development of new vernacular and terminology, et cetera. So I see a lot of these parallels, but equally so, I'm relatively convinced that Web3 is here to stay. And as a marketer, you either need to learn now and be a little bit ahead of the curve and sort of on the bleeding edge, or you learn later. I don't know what later is, frankly, whether it's a year, 5 years, or 10 years from now, but you will eventually have to learn. You will eventually have to adopt and adapt, right? And so for me, as a marketer and as a consultant, I would much rather be in control of when I learn, and I'd rather to do it now in my terms, rather than in 10 years when a client comes to me like, hey, I really need someone to do XYZ as it relates to Web3. And if I can't say yes, I can't come to the table well prepared and well educated, well, gosh, I'm at a disadvantage within the space, right?
Yeah.
So that's one response to the discomfort of learning a new technology.
Yeah, I'll throw in a maybe not a great comparison, but I'm teaching my kids golf right now, and they're learning at an earlier age than I did. And I think there's so much benefit to like learning it earlier, because even though it changes and at some point they maybe as adults would have learned it, you learn so much during that process about yourself too. So I'm a huge believer in learning it earlier.
Yeah, learn on your terms, be in control, learn as the game is developing, and so you're really in a good position when mass adoption finally takes hold. So to answer the second part of your question, like how do you learn a subject matter that's evergreen and constantly changing? Well, I learned the hard way that the traditional channels to learn, they just don't work with Web3. So for example, I bought a book called The Blockchain Revolution. I don't recall the authors, but the book wasn't that old. 3-5 years old max, I don't know, but like reading it was so incredibly dated. It was really painful. It's like reading things that like couldn't apply anymore to the space. And I found that so interesting and so shocking, really, that a book that seemed so young was completely irrelevant and completely dated. So you're not going to learn about Web3 in a book. You're probably going to learn through a series of, well, I love podcasts as my format of choice. It's for me personally, it's an easy way to keep in touch with subject matter areas that are unique and specialized, and I can do that while I'm commuting, doing laundry or shopping or whatever it may be, right? So it's really great for me.
Do you have a couple that you would suggest?
I do, yeah, of course. Let me have my phone here, so forgive me for looking down, but
no
I'm looking at my I'm looking at my podcast feed. So there's a CoinDesk podcast. I don't remember what it's called because they don't use the name in the title. It's called The Breakdown. I think the breakdown is very, very good. It's a daily podcast. It's about 15 or 20 minutes long and very pointed in its subject matter. CoinDesk has a Markets Daily podcast, which is equally interesting. There's Real Vision Crypto. Raoul Paul is a very influential person within the space. Crypto gets pretty niche pretty quickly. So, there's DeFi, decentralized finance, and gaming is very big. So there's a really interesting podcast called The Deconstructor of Fun, which I really like. The Scoop with Frank Chaparro is a very, very thoughtful podcast. And I'll finish with maybe Block Crunch with Jason Choi is not a bad one. Okay. So after the interview, I'll send some of these over. So
that's great.
Can have a look.
That's great.
So podcasts are great because they're sort of real time. The people who are able to continue on with their podcasts are usually pretty well respected in the industry and are able to defend a lot of the things that they say. BS is snuffed out rather quickly in this space. And then there are, newsletters that you can subscribe to depending on your areas of interest. Every project has a newsletter. Every major exchange has a newsletter that that'll recap things on a daily or weekly basis. And then just doing lots of reading. I don't have at the tip of my fingers here some of the examples of online resources, but there are databases in which like they have like the Bloomberg style websites that are interesting.
Okay, that's great. That's plenty. Thank you for that list. I think I hope a bunch of our people in our community jump on and start listening too. So another question for you, and this is probably a question you've gotten, I think probably, with all the volatility there's been recently.
Yeah.
I think about how that must be a huge challenge for these companies to manage, and just the shifting strategies that might already be happening right now. So if you have anything you can share about how are they managing the volatility right now?
Great question. The volatility in this space is more harsh, I would say, than traditional industries. And I think we're seeing the shakeout of a lot of bad behavior and ill-thought projects. And when we come out the other side, which I'm sure the industry will, once the dust settles, I think that only the strongest projects will last. Look, surviving volatility probably takes a few approaches and a few angles. One is the survival of the concept of the project itself, right? And again, within the Web3 space, it's all about community and getting a really strong, highly engaged and very sticky community. And if the community sticks by you and is very committed to the success of the project, I think that's one key effort.
Yeah.
The other is around funding, probably. Runway doesn't last forever. The burn rates of some of these projects can be quite aggressive, and a lot of the projects are bankrolled through the participation of these token issuances, right? It's really interesting where these projects, usually when you fund a project, you build the game or the project first, and then you go sell it to people who are convinced that it's a great project. Here, you do the fundraising first, the issuance of tokens, and then you build a game that sort of utilizes the tokens itself. So that is, I don't know how to hedge against that, frankly, because like token prices are so volatile and so dependent on participation and speculation, on utility, on people's anticipation of future value and returns. How to hedge against that is really tough. I'm an LP at some funds, and they're struggling, with this space and how to value long-term projects and how to seek out the projects that have the highest yield or alpha. And I think we're learning. The community is learning a lot of this.
Yep. And as you said, there's so many similarities. I mean, it brings me back to like when I first got to Silicon Valley. That was before the bubble burst, in the late 90s. And I remember people going, "Oh, it's over," just like they are now, right? And it just takes many cycles and a lot of learning. And so I'm with you. I think that it just has to sort its way out. And
that's right.
It is an interesting time as long as you can kind of ignore some of the volatility.
It's very nascent. It's the industry is it's still finding its footing. I think, for every 50 projects, maybe there's one or two really great, really world-changing ones. But I think that the volatility that we're experiencing today may help bring to the surface those more meaningful projects quicker than just the frothiness that we've been experiencing for the last 2 years.
Sure. And if anything I've learned in being in Silicon Valley this long, it's the minute somebody says, "I don't understand it, I don't get it," is actually usually the minute that there's some really profound innovation happening. If everybody understood it, it wouldn't be life-changing or different enough. So I continue to hear that every day. It's like, I don't get it. I don't want to be participating. And I'm like, there's probably a lot there. So, um, Damon, I'm up against time here. Is there anything else you wanted to share while we still have you?
No, well, I enjoyed the conversation. Look, I've been living overseas now for about a decade, and for me, it's been the most rewarding part of being a consultant and being a marketer,
Mhm.
learning different cultures, learning different ways of thinking and problem solving, and your approach to serving a particular community or interest has been really, really fascinating and highly rewarding for me as a professional and as an individual. So whether listeners choose to go down the crypto path or not, I highly encourage people to experiment,
Yeah.
try spending a month maybe in another place. It can be domestically, just a change of scenery can be very rewarding at an individual level, and see if you like it. And because I think that remote working and these things are probably here to stay. They've been
Yeah.
accelerated. They're always brewing. They've been
Yep.
accelerated by the pandemic. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, I'm very passionate about this topic, and I'd love to follow up.
Okay, that's great. And it's one of the gifts of the pandemic. It's now given everyone permission, now that we're in this remote first world, to displace them wherever they live and move to different places. There's really no more excuses if that's what you wanted to do with your life. And it works very well with being a freelance consultant to be able to
Yeah,
free yourself that up that way. And what you had said makes total sense, because when you do that, you accelerate your learning, not just
yeah.
while you're doing your work, but outside of work too.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. And I know we're on time, but I'll just finish with these two
Yeah.
observations in response to what you just mentioned. The first is, your second point. You are can continue to build your service offering, your repertoire of expertise, and what you can offer potential clients. Right? It's a global world and a global economy, and we have to reflect that, right? In our empathy with other people, other cultures, other ways of doing things. The second thing, in response to your first point, is that yeah, give it a shot. Like often for me personally, the hard path is usually the right path. Going off and doing your own consulting, freelancing is scary and difficult, and it's packed with uncertainty. And people feel very similar feelings as it relates to moving overseas, moving abroad.
Yeah.
It's really nerve wracking to uproot yourself and move to a very foreign place, but it can be one of the most rewarding things you ever do. Just like being a freelance consultant can be one of the most rewarding things you ever do. It's scary and it's
Yeah.
difficult, but the return that you get is, cannot be understated. So I'll leave you with that.